There was a storm, a dying dog, a woman who had stopped believing in miracles, a child who hadn't spoken a word in months, and by the time spring arrived, all 4 stories would tangle into one, stitched together by fur firelight, and the softest sound imaginable a name spoken for the first time, Murphy. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move, you please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The snow had fallen relentlessly over Maple Hollow, a secluded town tucked between the pine-lined foothills of Montana. Winter here was not just a season, it was a weight, a stillness, a silencer of all things alive. On the outskirts of town, beyond the last gas station and the shuttered diner, the road snaked through thick woods, narrow and mostly untouched. Tire tracks disappeared within minutes. It was down this frozen stretch that Rachel Moore drove her old Subaru creaking with protest as it made its way through the heavy snow. Rachel was a tall, slender woman in her early 40s with ash-blonde hair usually tied in a low, practical ponytail. Her features were sharp cheekbones, high nose, long eyes, a muted hazel, but softened by an expression that often seemed halfway between weary and kind. She wore a navy winter coat 2 sizes too big, once belonging to her late husband, and a faded green scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her hands, firm on the steering wheel, were pink from the cold, despite the car heater. Rachel had been a first-grade teacher at Maple Hollow Elementary for 15 years, known for her calm temperament and quiet resilience. She smiled often with her students, rarely raised her voice, and always stayed late during parent-teacher conferences. But since the accident last spring, the one that took her husband Daniel in a car crash on his way to a veterinary emergency, her smile had become rare. The silence in her log cabin echoed deeper in winter, and Christmas had passed like a shadow. She was returning from town after picking up groceries, mostly canned soup and tea, when something caught her eye. At first, it was nothing but a dark blur beyond the tree line, a smudge of contrast against the pristine white. But as she slowed headlights sweeping across the snow, the figure solidified into something horrifyingly real. A golden retriever, tied to a tree, covered in frost and snow. Rachel slammed on the brakes. The car fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop. Her heart leapt into her throat. She threw the door open, boots crunching against the packed snow, the wind knifing through her coat as she sprinted toward the tree. The dog, barely alive, was slumped against the trunk, his golden fur stiff with ice ribs visible through his emaciated frame. A heavy rope was knotted tight around his neck, frozen solid where it dug into his skin, biting into the flesh with an almost cruel precision. He didn't move. His eyes, glassy and dull, flickered but held no strength. He looked barely more than a shadow of life. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the snow soaking through her jeans. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice catching. "You're okay. I've got you." The dog didn't respond, but his side rose and fell barely. His name, she wouldn't learn until later, was Murphy. But now he was just a soul on the edge. He appeared to be about 5 years old, though the malnourishment made it difficult to tell. His fur was a dull, muddy yellow, matted and tangled in places, and his eyes, though half-lidded, had that distinct intelligence retrievers carried like a birthmark. Rachel tugged at the rope, but it wouldn't budge. It had been soaked and frozen, hardened like steel against the bark. She peeled off her gloves, fingers instantly, screaming from the cold, and tried to loosen the knot. Her fingernails scraped uselessly against the icy fibers. "Hold on," she breathed, trembling now, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Desperation. Rage. "You're not going to die here." Her mind raced. She had nothing sharp, no knife, no tools. She glanced back at her car, parked a dozen yards away. Could she carry him? Would he survive the time it took? She pressed her fingers gently to his neck. The rope had left a ring of red swollen flesh, and the skin felt like frozen leather beneath her touch. He whimpered the sound so soft it barely broke the air, but it was a sound, a response. Rachel blinked away tears. The snow kept falling, coating her hair, clinging to her lashes. A movement flickered across her mind, Daniel kneeling once beside a wounded fox, whispering softly while dressing a wound. He'd always said animals didn't need words, just presence, steadiness, a heartbeat they could borrow until theirs grew strong again. Rachel reached out again. "Stay with me." And Murphy, in some way she could not explain, did. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as she drove the car key into the block of ice binding the rope to the tree. The jagged metal scraped and slipped, but she kept digging, her hands numb and raw. Wind howled through the trees of Maple Hollow, whipping snow across her face and blurring her vision, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The rope was frozen into the bark like iron. Her fingers, pink and cracked, burned with cold as she clawed at it with her bare hands. She sobbed, not loudly, but quietly, with that kind of breathless desperation born from helplessness. "You're not dying here," she choked out, her voice hoarse. "Not like this." Murphy, the golden retriever, lay slumped against the tree, unmoving. His fur was matted with snow and frost, his ribs showing beneath the dull gold of his coat. The rope had cut deep into his neck now, swollen and red beneath the ice. He didn't whimper. He didn't blink. Only a faint rise and fall of his chest told her he was still holding on. Rachel pressed the key in again. A crack echoed through the silent woods, then another. The rope groaned, splintering slightly. She cried harder now, as though her tears might melt the ice faster. She tore at the strands, fingers shaking uncontrollably. At last, the final fiber gave way with a sickening snap. Murphy crumpled forward. Rachel dropped to her knees in the snow, catching him just before he hit the ground. His body was far too light for a dog, his size limp and lifeless in her arms. She wrapped her coat tightly around him, pulling him against her chest. The cold bit into her back through the thin cotton of her sweater, but she didn't care. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're okay. I've got you." With effort, she staggered back to the car, snow swallowing her footsteps as fast as she could make them. She pulled open the door, laid Murphy gently across the passenger seat, and tucked the coat more snugly around his thin frame. The dog didn't move. She dropped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine groaned before sputtering to life. She cranked the heater and peeled off her wet gloves with teeth and trembling hands. The wipers scraped across the windshield, barely clearing the thickening snow. Rachel gripped the wheel, blinking hard to push the blur from her vision. As the car crept forward along the narrow forest road, the woods around her grew deeper, darker, and colder. It was then, in the thick silence between gusts of wind, that a memory surfaced, unbidden but clear. Daniel. She had followed him once years ago when they were still newlyweds. A young couple with dreams too big for their small-town lives. It was after a storm much like this one when they heard a low, pained yowl echoing from the ridge behind their cabin. Daniel, ever fearless and stubborn, had gone out with a flashlight and his old vet bag. Rachel had begged him to wait to call for help, but he'd only smiled in that quiet, confident way of his and said, "If I don't go now, it might be too late." They found the wolf tangled in barbed wire near the edge of the ravine. Its leg was torn, blood soaking the snow. Rachel had frozen in fear, but Daniel had crouched slowly, whispering in that calm tone he used even with the most frightened animals. The wolf didn't bite, didn't growl. It just looked at him as though it knew he wasn't there to hurt it. Rachel remembered the way Daniel's hands had moved, gentle, precise, as he cleaned the wound and cut the wire. She remembered how he'd wrapped the leg in gauze, then opened the cage door without hesitation. the wolf had paused, limped out, and looked back at them once before disappearing into the woods. That night, Daniel had told her, "Sometimes animals just need to know someone's willing to fight for them, even if they've given up." Rachel blinked back tears as her car slid slightly on the icy road. Murphy lay still beside her, his body cocooned in her coat. "I'm fighting for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the heater. "You're not alone." The storm pressed in harder, but Rachel didn't stop. The path to her cabin curved ahead, flanked by pines heavy with snow. She knew every turn, every rut, and she knew one thing with absolute certainty: Murphy wasn't going to die in the cold. Not if she had anything to say about it. The wind outside raged on through the blackness of night, flinging snow against the windows like angry fingers tapping at the glass. But inside the cabin, Rachel Moore worked in silence, moving swiftly but with care. Her fingers still raw from ice, and rope trembled as she stacked the last of the split logs into the fireplace and struck a match. A soft whoosh and then warmth. The flame caught licking at the dry wood, casting its orange glow across the wooden walls. Shadows flickered and danced across the old photographs and bookshelves. Rachel stood still for a moment, her breath visible in the cold air, watching the fire grow. Then, shaking herself from the trance, she turned to the couch where Murphy lay, wrapped in her coat and 2 heavy blankets. The golden retriever hadn't stirred since she'd laid him down. His breathing remained shallow, his body unmoving, except for the occasional twitch in one ear or paw. Rachel knelt beside him again, slipping a heating pad between the blankets and placing it gently beneath his torso. The pad was old and frayed, the kind Daniel had kept on hand just in case. She plugged it into the outlet near the fireplace and watched as the tiniest bead of warmth began to creep through the layers of cloth. She pressed her hand against Murphy's side, still cold, but not like before. Rachel stood and moved to the kitchen, filling 2 hot water bottles from the kettle now steaming on the stove. She moved carefully, not wanting to leave him alone for too long. The kitchen was simple and functional, decorated with faded checkered curtains and old ceramic mugs hanging from a wooden rack. Every corner of this place held some trace of Daniel. His boots still sat by the door. His jacket still hung from a peg. Returning to the couch, she placed the bottles carefully along Murphy's abdomen and legs. He let out a faint broken sound. Not quite a whimper, more like a sigh. She knelt down, resting her head gently beside his, her face buried in the blanket that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You're going to be okay." Time passed slowly. The clock above the fireplace ticked minute by minute. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, Rachel sat on the floor, her hand never leaving Murphy's back. Sometimes she spoke soft words, nonsense really, just something to fill the air. Other times, she just listened to the fire crackle and the wind howl. Sometime after midnight, she noticed something, an irregularity in the line of Murphy's fur. Pulling back the blanket just slightly, she saw a thin, faint scar along his lower abdomen about 4 inches long. It was old, well-healed, but unmistakable. Surgical. Rachel's brow furrowed. She ran her fingers along the line gently. It wasn't from injury. It was too clean, too deliberate. A spay or neuter scar. No wrong placement. Perhaps abdominal surgery, but for what and by whom? She sat back, staring into the fire again, thoughts racing. Murphy wasn't just a stray. Someone had cared for him once. Someone had paid for that surgery. And someone had betrayed that care, left him to die tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere. Her eyes stung again, this time from anger. How could anyone do that? What had changed? Daniel used to say some dogs were made to help people heal. Therapy, dogs, companion animals, they had a gift. Maybe Murphy had once been one of them. Rachel turned her eyes to him again. His fur, now dry, glistened faintly in the firelight. His breathing had grown deeper. His ears, once drooped flat, now lifted slightly. Progress. Small but precious. The room grew warmer. She rose briefly to tend the fire, added a few more logs, and then sank back beside him. She wrapped another blanket around her own shoulders and pulled it close, curling beside the couch where she sat cross-legged watching the slow rhythm of Murphy's chest. The hours blurred. Somewhere near dawn, when the storm outside softened and the first light of morning crept through the frost-flecked windows, Rachel felt a subtle shift in the air. She glanced up from her half-doze and saw it. Murphy's eyes. Just barely, they fluttered open. Not wide, not full, but enough. She leaned closer, heart in her throat. He saw her. And then so faint it might have gone unnoticed, his tail shifted beneath the blankets. A slow, barely there wag. Rachel gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they didn't sting. She reached out and stroked his head with the back of her hand. "You came back," she whispered. "You really came back." He didn't move again. His eyes slipped shut, tail still. But the moment had happened. The snow had calmed by morning, leaving behind a silence that clung to the cabin like a held breath. The world outside was blanketed in white, untouched and still. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows that moved with the rhythm of the flickering embers. Murphy lay, curled in his blanket, eyes closed, but no longer unconscious, his breathing steady and even. Rachel, now wearing a gray wool sweater, and her late husband's fleece-lined boots, stood at the window with a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Her mind circled around the scar she'd discovered on Murphy the night before. Something in her gut told her it was more than just a medical routine. There was a story buried beneath that gold fur, one someone had tried to erase. She looked over at Murphy, who stirred as if sensing her gaze. His tail thumped softly against the cushion. That small movement, so simple and familiar, filled her with a warm ache. "Come on, boy," she said gently, setting her mug aside. "We're going to see someone who might have some answers." An hour later, the Subaru crunched over snow-packed roads as it made its slow descent into town. Rachel had wrapped Murphy in 2 blankets and secured him gently in the back seat. He rested his head against the cushion, watching the snow blur past the window. The vet clinic sat on the edge of Maple Hollow's main street, wedged between the post office and an old bakery that hadn't opened since Thanksgiving. The sign above the door still read Lowell Animal Care, though Dr. Richard Lowell was long past retirement age. Dr. Lowell was a man in his late 60s with a short, compact build and hands that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. His salt and pepper beard covered a square jaw, and his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had soothed both pets and their panicked owners for 4 decades. He had been Daniel's mentor once, back when Daniel was fresh out of veterinary school, and had watched Rachel and Daniel's life unfold from the background with a quiet fondness. The bell over the clinic door jingled as Rachel stepped inside carrying Murphy in her arms. The warmth hit her instantly, clean and comforting, filled with the scent of animals, old wood and lavender cleaner. Dr. Lowell emerged from the back office, his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. He wore a dark green flannel shirt under a white lab coat and had the kind of tired smile that made people feel safe. "Well," he said, peering over his glasses, "what have we got here? This is Murphy." "Rachel," said her voice soft. "I found him tied to a tree outside of town during the storm." Dr. Lowell's smile faded. He gestured toward the exam room. "Let's take a look." Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency, scanning Murphy's vitals, checking his ears and gums and palpating his abdomen. When he reached the scar, he paused. "Someone did good work," he muttered. This wasn't done at a shelter. He's had real care. Rachel nodded. That's what I thought. Can you scan him for a microchip? He gave her a look. Always do. Dr. Lowell retrieved the scanner and waved it slowly along Murphy's neck and shoulder blades. A small beep broke the silence. Well, there we go, he said, turning to the computer and typing in the code. Rachel held her breath. A name popped up. A local address. Does it say who she asked? Dr. Lowell glanced at the screen, then leaned back in his chair. Yeah, name's Peter Klein. He lives off the county road near the quarry. I know him. Rachel furrowed her brow. Does he have a history with animals? He used to, the doctor said, scratching his beard. Had a kid a few years back, boy named Ethan. Quiet kid. Didn't talk much, if at all. They got him a therapy dog through a state program. Golden Retriever. Fit the profile. Rachel looked at Murphy, suddenly understanding. Dr. Lowell nodded slowly. Must be. What happened? The old vet sighed. The boy died. Car accident about 1.5 years ago. After that, Peter stopped coming around, said he couldn't look at the dog anymore. I heard through the grapevine that he sent Murphy back to the agency, but maybe he didn't. Rachel finished, her voice tight. Dr. Lowell's eyes darkened. You found him tied to a tree. You said. Rachel nodded. Then I doubt he was returned anywhere official. There was a long silence. Can I call him? She asked. I need to know. Dr. Lowell studied her, then stood. I'll make the call. He stepped into his office. Rachel sat beside Murphy, running her hand slowly over his side. Her heart beat hard in her chest. A few minutes later, the door opened. Dr. Lowell returned, expression unreadable. Well? Rachel asked. He admitted it, the vet said simply. Said he got rid of the dog a few weeks ago. Said he was useless now that Ethan's gone. Rachel stared at him. Her fingers curled. Useless. He doesn't want him back, the vet continued. Said we could do whatever we wanted. Then I want to adopt him, Rachel said, rising to her feet. Officially. I don't care what shape he's in or what he's been through. He's not going back to that. Dr. Lowell nodded. We'll make it happen. Rachel looked down at Murphy. His eyes were open again, soft and alert. She knelt beside him. You're home now, she whispered. And this time his tail wagged with purpose. Winter didn't leave Maple Hollow with fanfare. It receded slowly, reluctantly, like a guest unsure if they had overstayed their welcome. Patches of brown earth peeked through the snowbanks, and icicles hanging from rooftops melted into steady drops that splashed onto thawing ground. The trees remained skeletal, but the air carried a softness now, a hint of something gentle on its way. Rachel Moore stood on the front porch of her cabin, watching the first blue sky she'd seen in weeks. Beside her, Murphy sat with his head raised, his golden coat catching streaks of morning sunlight. He looked stronger now. His ribs were no longer prominent, and his eyes, once dull and guarded, shimmered with the alertness of a dog who had remembered joy. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the visit to Dr. Lowell's clinic. In that time, Murphy had begun eating again, cautiously at first, then with more gusto as the days passed. His tail wagged when Rachel entered the room, and sometimes on good mornings he followed her around the house, his steps still a little slow but steady. Healing wasn't instant, but it was happening. Rachel had changed too. She moved with less hesitation now, spoke more to the people in town when she passed them at the market, answered texts from friends she'd ignored since Daniel died. Something had shifted inside her, something subtle but permanent. Grief hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like it was the only thing she carried. Today was a special day. Rachel zipped her coat, adjusted the scarf around her neck, and opened the passenger door of her Subaru. "Ready, Murph?" she asked. Murphy jumped in with a little help, his tail wagging. Rachel smiled and closed the door. They drove into town together past rows of pine trees and houses with smoke curling from chimneys. At the edge of town stood Maple Hollow Elementary, a red brick building trimmed with white wood with a small playground in the back, and murals painted by students on the outer walls. Rachel parked in her usual space, then went around to help Murphy out of the car. The children inside buzzed with the same post-winter energy that crackled through the town. Rachel walked through the front doors, greeted by the scent of crayons, pencil shavings, and cafeteria lasagna. As she passed the hallway, teachers nodded and smiled, some in surprise at the sight of the dog by her side. Inside her classroom, a group of first graders sat cross-legged on a circle rug, waiting for the day's morning meeting. Rachel's classroom was warm and inviting, with hand-painted name tags, a reading nook full of plush pillows, and student drawings taped to every corner of the walls. The alphabet ran in bold colors above the whiteboard, and sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows. As Rachel entered, Murphy trotted beside her, drawing instant gasps and giggles from the children. He paused in the doorway, ears perked, tail wagging slowly as he took in the scene. "Everyone," Rachel said, her voice bright, "this is Murphy." The students whispered and grinned, some already reaching out tentative hands. Rachel nodded. "You can pet him gently." Murphy moved among them with surprising calm. He let little hands stroke his head and tug gently at his ears. He sat, when told, even lifted a paw for one delighted girl. Rachel stood at the back watching it all unfold. And then she saw him, Liam. He sat slightly apart from the others near the bookshelf legs, crossed fingers fidgeting with the frayed edge of his shirt. Liam had transferred into her class just 3 weeks prior, right after winter break. He was 6 small for his age, with sandy brown hair that always stuck up in the back, and eyes that never quite met hers. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, Liam rarely spoke and never initiated conversation. He spent most of his days in silence, drawing quietly at his desk or stacking blocks in the corner. Rachel had tried everything: gentle engagement, visual cues, sensory breaks, but nothing had seemed to breach his careful bubble. Until now. Murphy approached him slowly, his movements gentle. He didn't rush, didn't bark, didn't even wag. He simply stopped in front of the boy and sat. Liam looked up. It was the first time Rachel had ever seen his eyes truly focused on anything in the room. Murphy tilted his head. Liam stared for a long moment, then almost imperceptibly extended one hand. Murphy leaned forward and rested his head in Liam's lap. And then, like a whisper breaking through fog, it happened. "Murphy," Liam said. The room went silent. Every child froze. Every tiny voice halted mid-word. Rachel's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her chest. She moved forward, slowly, not to interrupt, but just to be near. Liam looked up at her. His mouth was still slightly open, his hand stroking Murphy's fur in slow, even movements. "Murphy," he said again, quieter now, but clear. Tears filled Rachel's eyes. She knelt beside the boy, brushing a hand gently over his shoulder. Murphy didn't move. He just stayed there, his tail thumping softly against the rug. And Rachel, who had spent so long waiting for something to shift, something to break through the cold inside her, felt it finally melt. Not with fanfare, not with loud declarations, but with one name spoken softly by a child who hadn't spoken to anyone else. Later, when the bell rang and the students filed out, Rachel sat on the rug alone beside Murphy. Her cheeks were damp, but she wasn't crying from pain this time. "I think you were made for this," she whispered, stroking his fur. "Just like I was made to find you." Murphy nudged her hand with his nose, then curled against her side. The last snow of winter melted that week. And in the quiet that followed a woman and a dog both broken, both healing began again. Sometimes miracles don't come with lightning or thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly on four paws, with tired eyes and a wounded heart. Murphy wasn't just a dog left to die. He was a messenger of healing, a reminder that even when we are abandoned, broken, or forgotten, love can still find us. And sometimes God sends that love not in grand gestures but in quiet moments, like a tail wag in the snow, or a single word from a silent child. In our everyday lives, it's easy to miss these small blessings. But when we choose compassion, when we rescue instead of turn away, we open the door for grace to work through us. Just like Rachel found purpose again and Liam found his voice, we too can become vessels of hope if we listen, if we care, if we act. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light today. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories of faith and healing. And say a prayer for every soul, human or animal, still waiting to be seen, heard, and loved. And if you believe that God still works through kindness, through animals, through second chances, type Amen in the comments. Let the world know that you believe in love that rescues and grace that never gives up.